This is the second part of the lecture, and I just wanted to finish up talking about the nature of the discipline article a little bit. And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it, and a lot of the information in that piece is similar to what you read in the Peter Stearns Why Study History piece. But I think the key thing to understand is the difference that's laid out in this little article between the past and the memory of the past. And what we're doing with history as a discipline is dealing with the memory of the past. And you can say, well, we're talking about the recorded memory specifically, but basically it's what we know collectively about history, that is our collective memory about what happened, rather than simply everything that happened, because there's a lot that happened that we don't know about, and so it's not part of history. And that's really the difference. I'll be happy if you come out of this course understanding this basic fact, that most of what has happened in human history will remain unknown forever, and we'll never know about most people who lived and died in the past. We'll never know about most events that occurred. We know such a small fragment of what happened. Obviously, when we get closer to the present, in the last century especially, we think at least we have a better sense of what happened. We have better records almost everywhere in the world in the last 100 years than we had earlier. And so as we get closer to the present, we have a better sense of the past, we think. We'll go back a few hundred years, go back 1,000 years, and it's obviously very difficult to know what happened. There just aren't a lot of written records, and there's a disproportionate number of records from certain places, mainly the Western societies, as we call them, of Europe. Later on, after the settlement of North America and South America, the Americas as well, but relatively few sources, written sources, from most of the rest of the world. And what few written sources we have often come from foreigners, travelers who visit places and leave some written record of their visit, but their views are often colored by their own experiences and their own perspectives, their own biases, and so we can't trust them completely either. And that's a larger problem. We can't trust a lot of the historical documents that we're left with. Someone writes something down. How do we know whether or not they are recording it correctly? How do we know if they aren't trying to prove some point by recording it in a certain way? The best case scenario is we have multiple versions of events that we can compare to each other, but that's not often the case. Often we have one account of something that happened in the past, and then we have to balance that with whatever else we know about that time period and try to figure out how much this one account can be trusted, how much we need to take with a grain of salt. And as much as we need to do that, we need to explain in articles, in books, why we're making that argument, why we think that this particular account should be trusted, why we think there may be parts of it that are true, but parts of it that we can't take as seriously. All of that is what historians do when they write articles, when they write books. They try to interpret these sources, right? They try to explain to readers, whether those readers are students or the general public or other historians, explain why they think, as experts in their little field of history, why they think these sources should be interpreted this way. Now, most of the history that you've read probably in your lives is in the textbooks, and textbooks are nothing more than a digest of what other historians have written, and trying to take that accumulated knowledge and put it into a form that can be comprehended by a student in a classroom. But it's made up of, a textbook is made up of thousands upon thousands of articles and books that have been written on a subject. So an American history textbook is looking at, the authors are looking at thousands of articles on colonial America, thousands of articles on slavery, thousands of articles on women in the 19th century, whatever it is, and they're trying to condense the best of those articles, the most reliable studies of the past, into something that makes sense in a couple of paragraphs on a page for students to read and learn from. So understanding that process, I think, is an important part of this course. You're going to go through that process with the two papers on the Cherokee removal and on the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire of 1911, and you're going to go through that process as historians of taking primary sources, that is, documents from the time period that we're studying, whether those are letters between a Cherokee man and his wife, or those are newspaper articles from that describe the Triangle Fire of 1911. Whatever the primary sources are, you're going to have to interpret those and figure out how you can use those sources in your paper to say something, to make an argument, a thesis about the subject, and explain to your reader, me, how you're getting there. Explain how it is that you are using these documents to make this case, how it is that they support your argument. We'll obviously come back to the papers later in the course, but I want you to start thinking about how this process of history, how this works, it is a process, for one thing, right? That it's not simply memorization of facts. In fact, it's not that at all. There are very few facts that we can point to in history. Are things we accept as facts today, we might realize 10 years from now, as we find some new sources, some new evidence, or a new way of interpreting existing evidence, that our facts were wrong, and we have to change our facts. So I want you just to keep that in mind as you go through this course, that we're dealing with interpretation, we're dealing with process, this process of doing history rather than knowing history, because nobody can fully know what happened. The best we can do is take an educated guess. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, for tomorrow, you're reading this piece by James Loewen, a sociologist who's written a lot about history, specifically written about the problems that he's found, and not him alone, in American history, and the way American history is presented to students, especially at the high school level. So this chapter that you're reading part of on Christopher Columbus is a part of a larger project where he examines the way that history is taught and written about in the United States. So I think that the questions I put on Blackboard are fairly clear, but again, Columbus is this figure who's become quite controversial in recent years, still celebrated by many people, by many communities in America and around the world, but also disparaged by many people and by many communities in America and around the world. And I'm hoping that looking at this chapter will give you some new perspective. Some of you may have seen this or similar readings before, but take another look at it, and just follow the instructions on Blackboard, and we'll see where we go with it. Thanks.